We are live, and I'm not picky this time. Sorry about that. Sorry, yeah, you have the right to go first. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
All right, sounds good. So the quote that we picked was there are some stupid mistakes that only very smart people make. And one of them is the notion that a sensible argument, seriously presented, can compete with a really good piece of theater. And this is from the reading by Laurie Penny, I Will Not Debate You. And it was said in the context of giving a platform to, or rather, Laurie Penny argues that we should not give a platform to everyone, especially those who don't have, who do not argue in good faith and instead use theatrics to present sometimes harmful and sometimes disingenuous arguments. And this quote highlights that it's a mistake that oftentimes, lots of sensible people make to uphold freedom of speech above all and think that this is an ultimate net good because from their point of view any serious argument can win over any of these disingenuous arguments simply by the virtue of being more true and factually rigorous, which from her opinion she does not think is the case. So with respect to that, I have to say that it's definitely a quote that gets me in the sense that I can't really say for sure how much I believe it and how much I don't. It doesn't seem like it doesn't hold water. It definitely seems like something anecdotally I may have experienced or I can see being true. But at the same time, I wish it weren't, or I would like to think that there is a world where, or our world is one where, if you seriously present arguments or seriously make an effort to have a serious discussion, then you can eventually make someone see the truth. So, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I am. Well, first of all, I would actually say freedom of speech for me isn't just it's almost like the starting issue for me of what drew me into politics. Like before I knew anything about anything in all of politics, I knew just like that was kind of first real policy that I'd sort of latched onto. But on the other side, as much as I do believe in freedom of speech, I don't want to downplay the issues that she's bringing up to sort of glorify, I guess, my perspective, because especially in the age of social media, it seems like the most sensationalist, conspiratorial, like inflammatory nonsense can always rise to the top of any platform, which makes sense because if I go on Twitter and I post like a linear regression I did of the relationship that I found between years of post-secondary education and wages and unemployment, that won't get as many likes as someone who goes on there and is just talking about how like these wind turbines are causing autism. That's a fact. Like these kind of inflammatory, you know what I mean? These sort of sensationalist pieces of theater that even if they don't convince everyone, they always get everyone's attention somehow. That guy, he might convince 20 people, but even then he's distracted 200 people who are just going over to look at this piece of theater, and they're already giving this person more airtime. And the more airtime you give someone, eventually, when all you're exposed to is just different pieces of sensationalism, it just becomes people picking their poison rather than dismissing it all as they should. As far as the state of of public opinion on that, um, I think a lot of it would just have to be the responsibility of media consumers to, as much as this is going to sound harsh to put on the general public, but like acts like adults. Like when you're engaging with news, you need. I feel like adults need to have a certain conscientiousness of like going to reputable sources and staying away from these sort of snake oil salesmen and what are I think reasonably could just be called liars, of these people with these kind of insane views. And I would just sort of I mean my perspective doesn't seem to be working very well, but just ask people to be responsible with what media they consume, I guess would be my first instinct.
Yeah, I think the issue with that one is it's very hard to get, you know, the public in mass to be responsible in that way with the media they consume, doing fact checking, and really, you know, sifting through that information and coming out with the nuggets of truth. I mean, that is why we have ethics in journalism and whatnot, because for the large part the public does believe what is presented to them, and especially when it's very good pieces of rhetoric and you don't have the tools to tell one from another. um, it is, very hard to be able to tell what you believe in and what you don't. And I mean, this is kind of what you see these days, right? You have, random posts on um, social media or even mainstream outlets, and there's contradictory, evidence or contradictory ideas being put forth and presented as truth. Oftentimes, opinion is truth, and people take it at face value, take it as fact, and run with it, right? And so you have two different narratives that are being peddled by a large subset of the public, where then you get divides and you get issues where reconciling what the real truth is becomes much, much harder, and working forward towards, solutions of any sort, or even acknowledging that these problems exist and our society should be moving forward in this way, becomes near impossible, because you start from two different premises. One which reflects what is actually out there and is based on some sort of serious argument, some sort of, basis, right? Like that's academically sound, and one that isn't so, right? And you see that both worldviews are very popular in the current media landscape.
Yeah, I am. And that's the thing. I think you've brought a pessimism to the table of like people. It's hard, yeah, to just sort of point to the people and say like, okay, people need to be responsible with what they consume. When well, clearly, like I think we agree that that isn't really the case. People aren't really acting responsibly in this manner, and you are right. I guess the kind of bleak thought that I have is that if if we live in a society where no one cares about truth, like there just aren't really any actors who care about truth in any way, I'm I'm kind of perplexed from like an economic or engineering perspective, thinking of a way we could arrange institutions that would promote truth, where where most people seem to be more consumed with these sort of sensationalist pieces of rhetoric. What I do think, that I do see as a pretty definitive ranking though is that in sort of the way we have it now of sort of this like sort of a platform to everything, right? Like this sort of whatever you want to call it, giant cooking pot of different ideas. You do live in a world where people essentially will peddle lies for profit. I think we can agree there that like most major news moguls don't really seem to take seriously, whether or not what they're saying is true, so much as is it going to get ratings. And the consumers are just as bad because they'll turn on anything that entertains them. I'm guilty of it. I get half my news from these Twitch streamers because they're like funny and they have their little emotes and chat and stuff, rather than like much more time that I spend actually going to like a database and looking through scientific articles. But I guess the part that I do think that I think this author miscalculated is that if you live in a world where like elites or some kind of like controlled group has like a monopoly on what gets platformed and what doesn't, those people don't necessarily care about truth either, except oftentimes they don't care about truth in a way that's more nefarious. It's less a matter of laziness and it's more a matter of like if you live in a world where like academic institutions or like large corporations do like deplatform and have a very controlled narrative, it wouldn't just be misinformation; it would be more disinformation, because corporations and even academic institutions tend to have their own agendas, if that makes sense. Um, yeah, I guess that would be my kind of my thinking on that of why I'm skeptical of the deplatforming taking to its extreme.
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously take it to, or you could obviously frame it in that way where um, agendas get pulled into the picture, and so deplatforming is used as a tool or a weapon to spread a certain narrative very
Mm-hmm.
selectively. But let's say that is not the case, right? Even that, like, let's say someone is very genuinely curating content, curating what is good research. Is it always possible to do this in such a way that it at all times benefits society? Because that I think is a rather hard thing to do. Although you gotta say it's not something that doesn't exist in our society, and something that doesn't happen. I mean, for example, academic journals, academic papers, academia as a whole is essentially this, right? It's where tightly curated bits of knowledge are peddled forward, and curated in the sense of, is this worth covering?
Mm-hmm.
Is this thoroughly researched and has academic rigor? And, this gets verified by a community of academics who have, the same accolades. So, um, is academia in that way problematic? I don't know. I can't say I've done enough research to look into that, but I would say that the peer review process and the rigor of academic journalism,
Mm-hmm.
does leave. It is rather nice to know
Mm-hmm.
that that exists, because academia is our foundation for building uh, knowledge on top of it, right? And so for it to be watered down and for it to not, you know, have a stable base would be rather problematic. Now, when we bring it to general mainstream media and public discourse, because I mean, the average person isn't reading academic papers or
Mm-hmm.
getting their sources from there. They get it from, you know, the media, who takes these sources and waters them down, which is nice. It's easier access to the knowledge, but then also general media adds a lot of other views that wouldn't get a platform in academia, just because of the time commitment to it, and because of the urgency of certain bits of information. Like if a current event is unfolding and you need an opinion piece about it, then you're not going to go through the entire academic process
Mm-hmm.
like as a university would to get that peer reviewed and published. you,
Mm-hmm.
you just put it out. So there's some practical considerations there, but to the point of having curated bits of knowledge, having not exactly a centralized but semi-centralized authority that curates and disseminates that information, it's, to be honest, not unheard of. I'd say that's very similar to how academia operates.
Yeah, and I do. The thing is, I would say, like, the scientific community is probably one of the institutions in society that I have the most confidence in. In fact, I'd actually say it's probably the one that I'd say we should be most proud of. Like, looking at all of history and all of the crap that's happened, that humans have done over the last 10,000 years, I can actually look at our scientific peer review, as weird as it sounds to say, our scientific peer review process and say it's better than the just millennia of theocracies that we had before, where we actually do have rigorous standards of what counts as science and what doesn't. Now, the one issue there is that unfortunately, not even science is immune from, I guess, the influence of money. And the example I would give, and this is an anecdote. It is an anecdote, but it's in the 1950s. The the scientist who actually discovered the age of the Earth, and he was a very well respected scientist, began to actually uncover research that showed that putting lead in gasoline was like incredibly hazardous for the environment. You might have heard the phrase leaded gas as like one of the worst things we did in like the 40s and 50s. And he found like lots of evidence that he was able to dig up, and he did go through all of the steps that he did as a chartered scientist who had done incredible work before. But it just seems like the endless pile of money that could always throw in pieces of uncertainty, of doubt, of, well, is lead bad for the atmosphere? Is it causing cancer? That sort of could continue always drudging up studies, because the side of, I guess, scientific doubt became so powerful once the essentially the gas companies got involved, that it became impossible for this guy to bring his research to fruition and get the funding to bring his research to fruition, to take it to the government and say, look, we need to stop putting lead in our gasoline. And I think this is a bit of a side note. I think the way he proved it is that he went to the Arctic and he drilled through and he said, look, the last 10 years have had 2,000 times as much lead as the million years before it, as sort of his proof of that. But so that's one issue, I guess, of science does seem to have, as good as it is, emphasis on as good as it does seem to have its own forms of corruption.
Yeah,
And money and
that's
interest.
very interesting. I mean, like, of course, there are always ways of rigging your data in order to show one thing rather than another. And I mean, this is what a lot of think tanks are um, guilty of doing, right? You take corporate money and then you push, or you do science, or you do research as an academic, but in a way that favors your benefactors, but or pushes their agenda. Now, this I would say is not real science, and if you are rigorous in the way that you go through the academic process, you should be able to. I mean, in an ideal world, these things don't hold water, right? Because the whole idea behind publishing something in a scientific journal is you also publish the context in which you did the experiment, what sort of an environment you had, right? Your falsifiability
Mm-hmm.
claims and so on. And, it should be reproducible. And a majority of scientists, for example, when they look at their data, they'd be like, okay, so this research was bogus, whereas this research was sound and legitimate, or more likely to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're a serious scientist, then you take that and you try and reproduce the results, right? And eventually, as a couple of other scientists do it, then that is the point of science.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you're beholden to this guy said this and that guy said that, therefore I got to decide between these two. No, you simply ask the universe, you do your
Mm-hmm.
trials, and the universe will give you an answer. Unfortunately, with a lot of other sects of knowledge, it is not so easy to do. This is generally the case with social sciences, right? Where it's depend the answer doesn't exist out there in the universe, but it's a social construct or a human construct, right? And to that end, spinning up disingenuous arguments or spinning up disingenuous narratives can be truly harmful, because they, in fact, change the very fabric of society to reflect that worldview, right? As a history teacher of mine once said, it's the world we're living in, right now reflects most closely to Alice in Wonderland, in the sense that, you know, you say something is the way it is, and suddenly, the world reflects that. You put enough of an idea of a social construct into someone's head, and suddenly the world starts to reflect it. Um, Not quite in a very literal sense that If you say
I know,
this
I know,
wall isn't there, it's
no,
but
well, I mean that's like the basis of like linguistics.
mhm,
Like people first they say God be with ye, and then they start shortening it to good be, and then eventually everyone just says goodbye, and God's kind of out of it. Like we kind of like it's become secular, just in the nature of people stopped thinking of it as a they stopped even thinking of its original context. And you're right. That sort of is just languages become what people want them to be. I think is that kind of what you're getting at. I hope that's sort of like in fields like linguistics and culture that it's there isn't an objective answer. So if we say it's true, it is. Is that sort of
uh, less so of that, but more so of a lot of our lived experiences come from a constructed reality, right? Like, for example, fiat currency. This is valuable because it is valuable. That's
yes?
it, right? Now, that was a really easy example, but a lot of the more complex things in our society are also in the same way, right? Social constructs. And this is the way it is because, we it is the way it is,
Mm-hmm.
and because somebody said it and
Mm-hmm.
enough people believed it, it is the way it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you know that's not something that was set in stone from the time that we were born.
Mm-hmm.
These things continue to change, and so there is a real, physical harm to to essentially controlling that narrative, right? Or being able to set the terms of what is and what isn't, right? And what you generally see in the rhetoric or in the public sphere and with rhetoricians is they're not, trying to push arguments in bad faith, which essentially have no consequence. It's just a meaningless debate, or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just to pull a win. But rather, they're talking about things that have serious consequences to other people or society at large, right? And so, to this end, it's I guess what I'm trying to point out is with science and like our whole discussion about the scientific method and academic rigor and academic publishing, the universe is the way it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can try and spin a narrative, but if anyone does any serious research or you really, follow the
Mm-hmm.
scientific method and what ought to be academic rigor
Mm-hmm.
to a T, then eventually you'll come across the truth, right? Or at least that's the idea. That's the tenets
Yes, yeah.
of
I well,
science.
I get what you're saying. The reason I brought up linguistics is because that seems like the most clear cut example of what you're talking about of like social constructs. Like the
Mhm.
word cheese, that syllable doesn't inherently connects to the substance. It's just
Mhm.
everyone says that cheese is fermented milk in English speaking countries. And cheese doesn't mean milk in Turkey because that's not what the Turks use to describe that substance. Like it's that kind of a that's kind of
Right.
the
No, I
simplest.
get it.
Yeah,
I get
yeah.
what you're trying to say now.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and on that, and this is kind of really does bring us into kind of Alice in Wonderland territory. I don't know that even the quote can do us much justice because I don't think in realms like that there is a difference between like objective academic rigor versus pieces of theater. And what I mean in that sense is that when you get into these concepts of I guess like language and social constructs, ultimately I don't think you can make a distinction of well that's just rhetoric, that's not fact, because there isn't really fact in that realm. Um, and the example that I see is just yeah in the realm of debate, especially around like identity. Um, People always sort of make these as if they sort of mimic scientific arguments about what identities fit into which categories. Endlessly, what counts as a real this, what counts as a real that. All this sort of yeah, and it can go across anything. It can go across religious identities, racial identities, gender identities. This sort of arguments about what the categories mean, so to speak, and who fits in and who doesn't. Um, and to me, it kind of kind of building off of what you're saying. It's like, well, there isn't really a scientific answer. Unfortunately, there's no scientific answer that we put we put a chemical test in the water and say, okay, this is what a real Christian is, because it's kind of arbitrary. So in that sense, I don't know that the quest to try to push rhetoric out in favor of objectivity is possible, because if in issues like that, I think almost everything is rhetoric.
Yeah.
If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was trying to almost what I was trying to get at. That, like, with science, or with physical sciences, it's straight cut, whereas with social sciences, or other matters of social constructs, it's a lot more gray area, like you said, right? And it's harder to tell, harder to distinguish. But even within like epistemological relativism, I like to think that it's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't say, oh, this is there is no good way to go about this. There is no basis for knowledge, and so we should just all say, yeah, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
I I mean, the reason I believe we're even having discussions is because we all, to some degree, don't
Well,
think that way, right?
what,
We all don't think that
what
we could say whatever. And
okay, I think I can build a real foundation on them. Bring back to one of the reasons that I fall on the free speech side. In a public discourse about culture that's dictated by freedom of speech, um, the social constructions of what various things are in, we'll call it the realm of culture, and I'll use culture to mean things that are man-made, so to speak, like we've been talking about. Like the law of gravity is not culture. That's a thing. Um, and in that realm, the reason I would believe in freedom of speech and believe in sort of the pro platforming is because in that realm, culture can kind of develop organically to mean and not mean what it needs to mean for the people in that context at that time. And I look at this as like like the trivial examples would be linguistics, where it does seem like languages expand and contract depending on what people are talking about at certain times. Like there's a lot of words that are probably that are probably no one knows about, like the different parts of a sailboat, of like this is the mast, this is the boom, this is all these different parts, because most people don't need to use those words, in the 21st century. Whereas, for example, words for articles of clothing has continued to expand endlessly as the fashion industry has grown. So I guess the case I'm making is that my case for freedom of expression in the general public square, and by that I don't just mean the legal right, but maybe the cultural and economic general, that media platforms and universities should be inclusive in who they present, would be that it allows for self-determination on the part of the society and context, where the average person can sort of interact with the language and with these debates and sort of decide what the fate of these social constructs are. Whereas in I'll say a censorious world, language means what a closed group of linguists want it to mean, or whatever. Pick any topic you want in this realm of culture. But yeah, I don't know. I guess what are your thoughts on that?
yeah, except I feel like that kind of that kind of ignores what the article is trying to bring up by Laurie Penny, right? And it's this idea that you know, while we think that ought to work, right, where you have the freedom of speech, and then culture will choose what is ultimately best order, the free marketplace of ideas and whatever, right? The reason that that may not necessarily hold water is because oftentimes, like, especially when it comes to these cultural arguments, now even if we go with this idea that, yeah, like, none of these rules are set in stone, right? And so we can go. It is kind of a mistake to think that we can go and say whatever, right? Because in our specific time and context, right, there are certain things that are true, right? That we agree to be true. And then from there, we can build upwards, right? Like, for example, if this were, like thousands of years ago in Egypt, and we look up at the sky and, we look at that big ball, that big yellow ball in the sky, and we're like, oh, what's that, right? And we said the sun, then of course we'd get laughed at. It's like, no, of course that's the sun god Ra, for example, right?
That's Ra, yeah.
And yeah, and that is true for their context, and from there they build up on their society, right? Okay, that's the sun god Ra, and so then there are implications. That means we must do things, right, like religious ceremonies, whatnot, right? But for our context, our time and space, I look up the sky and I'm like, oh, that's the sun god Ra. No, of course not, right? People would think I'm crazy, right? It is just untrue, right? And so, given this context, time, and society, that is not true. That is a big ball of,
Yeah.
that's a nuclear reaction.
That's
up
a
in the
nuclear
sky,
reaction,
right?
yeah.
And so, given that, there are implications, right? And so, similarly, like when it comes to our social constructs, right, there are things that, given our time and context, most of us agree on, and the reason it matters is because there's implications, right? Now, when you take somebody who starts off with premises that we as a whole do not necessarily agree upon, or that are warped in order to satisfy some sort of narrative. And for example, like proponents of eugenics or racial superiority, right? And then from there they build their logic and logic, right, from a false premise.
Oh, you froze up. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm looking at a frozen screen with no audio right now. Um, Unsecured network. Trying to reconnect. Sorry about that. My
Okay.
Wi-Fi decided to take a holiday. I did. The last thing I heard was you were talking about essentially false premises. Um, Basically, why yeah, you were talking about people working from the false premise of eugenics. Was I think the last thing that I'd heard in what you'd said.
Right. Well, basically, and is it still recording, or did that
It is
fail?
still it is still
Okay,
recording.
Basically, all I was trying to say there was, you have certain types of people who start with these and are disingenuous in the way that they go about it because, they know what they're doing. And the idea there isn't to have a serious discussion, or the truth sort of isn't the aim here. The aim is to cordon off as much of the audience as you possibly can into your worldview to then gain a large enough following to push this narrative and make it the truth, right? It's not concerned with what the truth is, even given its relative thing, but it's more concerned with pushing an agenda. And so you have two people, like let's say they're having a debate or they have a platform. It's, how much of the audience can I get? How much of the audience can you get? And it's this struggle to, I start from here and I push this over here and you push that over there. And the truth is out of the picture. It's no longer a discussion. It's more of a tug of war, right? And I don't know how productive that is, at least when the truth is concerned.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the thing. I don't know. There's one thing that kind of makes this muddier, and it's that you use the word I agree with what you're saying. There are these we'll call them like these Machiavellian actors with these pretty brutal ideas, if I'm being honest, who are like trying everything in their power to push their way through and basically dominate the culture with less than, we'll say less than stellar ideas about their fellow humans. Um, but I guess the issue that sort of comes up when I look at that situation is that I'm like even within its relativistic context of truth, um, looking at, I guess, I don't know about the free marketplace of ideas, because I actually don't think that the free marketplace of ideas necessarily, like we said, determines the most accurate scientific ones. When it comes to culture, where it is a place where just the general public sort of creates it as they discover it, um, if we don't just sort of leave it to the people, if we agree that we're not just going to leave it to the people of, culture is what people say it is, citing what I'd say is a fairly relevant claim, well, then okay, like is racism good if everyone thinks that racism is good? Then I guess what sort of framework could we use above this, I guess, the general public to judge what are like true and false ideas? It kind of seems like a Who Watches the Watchmen type situation, where if yeah, like if I guess I guess what I'm getting at is that in these kinds of situations, um, yeah, I don't know. I guess like is there a framework above sort of the market that we could use that judges, okay, these are good ideas and these aren't? Because you had mentioned like, well, the free marketplace of ideas doesn't work, and one way of looking at that is, well, what does work mean in the context of in the context of culture? Um, yeah, like I don't really know, and I'd make an analogy to like film criticism is like an example of this, where a critic can say, well, that's a horrible movie, but the movie will make like more than $1 billion, and we're kind of left with this philosophical question of like, well, are movies like inherently good or bad? If everyone likes the movie, does that make it a good movie? Is it a totally, well, then the movies that make the most money is like Transformers, and it's like, well, is that the best movie? Like, I don't know. It's what the free marketplace of culture would say is the best, but I guess I don't know. Maybe you can see the dilemma I'm bringing up, of how do we sort of determine when. Yeah, I guess what would be, yeah, I've sort of phrased the question. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's just a generally hard one to kind of find a solution to. I feel like that's, as a society, that's a work in progress that we're all going through, even in academia. Yeah, I mean, that's feel like that's what a lot of the social sciences are built upon. It's that hard question of how do we know what is true? How do we know what is right? Right? How do we go about doing this hard intellectual work of sifting through what's before us and determining what's knowledge and what's junk, right? Um, and yeah, it's just generally a hard thing to do. I mean, we have heuristics, and I believe there's a lot of them. It's very hard to list them all out, but certainly there are better ways of going about it than others, right?
Yeah.
And we can potentially just turn to those, but having a centralized authority determining that, I don't know, maybe that seems like a very too simple of a solution than what the problem asks for.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, I try my best to ground my. Well, I'll say a few things. One thing, I do have, I guess, an ethical. Not even ethical. Ethical would even be that too shallow. An almost like philosophical belief that, like, if you're born on Earth, you should have the I guess like one of your inalienable rights, in the same way that you have the inalienable right to like live, or the inalienable freedom from slavery, or sort of these inherent human rights that we should see are in ourselves, even if no one else recognized them. And I do see freedom of speech in that realm, but I also, like, I don't think freedom of speech is necessarily like, it's not the right to a platform, like it's the right it's the right not to go to jail for saying something,
Mhm.
which makes it more complicated. Which then, for me, I guess brings it into the realm of the practical. Of throughout history, it seems like societies that have done the best to, let's say, move themselves towards an organic and healthy state of culture, on the one hand, and on top of that, I would say like a scientifically accurate worldview, would be ones that actually have freedom of expression in practice versus centralization and censorship. And the example I would actually give would actually be, sorry, it's a bit of a medieval history nerd moment, but in like 600 years ago, I'm sure as you're aware, like Europe was dominated by like the ultimate centralized authority of the Catholic Church, where like their whole culture was built around there's one guy in Italy who talks to God, and then God tells him what words mean and what is right and wrong, and how much taxes you should pay, and then he just distributes that message to the rest of Europe. And that was true in science too, as I'm sure you've heard of Galileo and the Pope. Of Galileo started making claims about how the Earth might not be the center of the universe, the way that the Aristotelian model said, and this was challenging thousands of years of European culture and was thrown out as this nonsense. But and as this kind of cliche, medieval Europe was like just kind of filled with lies because of that tyrannical censorship the church had. Of anytime anyone tried to do any sort of science, they were sort of squashed out by these I'll call them superstitious tyrants. But on the flip side, I look at like the Islamic Golden Age in the Ottoman Empire at the same time in human history, during the same centuries that this sort of medieval censorship was going on in Europe, where they had almost absolute freedom of speech, and the Islamic world seemed to just skyrocket in terms of their pursuit of truth and of just a healthy culture. They were remarkably liberal. During the Spanish Inquisition, people actually went from Spain into the Middle East as a way to hide from religious persecution. They invented cameras before electricity was working, like early pinhole cameras. They were charting astronomy, and I look at this dichotomy, and I see it. And one thing it makes me realize is that, it kind of puts to bed the old colonialist idea that science and rationality are European ideas. It's like, no, like you have to look at this time period. But it also to me kind of shows that for all of the falsehoods that might show up in